What's up, everybody? Corey Hughes, Bloody History. Back once again. Continuing. 8 plus 2 equals 10. Part 3. Obviously, the 8 plus 2 equals 10 reference being to that of the Secret Service car. You know, that car full of a bunch of fucking lying cunt traitors to their country. Who were only supposed to have 8 men on it as they made their way to Parkland Hospital. But in reality had 10 men on it because they picked up 2 passengers. They picked up Jack Valente and they picked up David Morales. It's just hilarious how many people will look at that picture of David Morales and be like, that's not David Morales. Look, motherfucker. Fuck you. Okay, that's David Morales, you dumb shit. Fucking, it's amazing how many people don't believe their lying eyes. But, I digress. So, let's continue. White House detail, November 29th, 1963, statement by William McIntyre. The following events regarding the assassination of the late President Kennedy are outlined. To the best of my knowledge, no statement is based upon information released by any form of news media. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, I was working the 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. shift of the Secret Service White House detail and was under the supervision of 8-SAC Emory Roberts. Other agents working that day were Jack Reedy, Don Lawton, Glenn Bennett, and 2 agents assigned to Mrs. Kennedy, Clint Hill, and Paul Landis. The presidential aircraft, Air Force One, arrived at Dallas Love Field, Dallas, Texas, approximately 11:40 a.m., November 22nd, 1963. The above-mentioned agents departed the front of the aircraft and assumed protective positions around the president when he departed the rear exit of Air Force One. The president walked close to a large crowd and shook hands with the people for approximately 5 to 10 minutes. He then stepped into the presidential limousine, an open car, and was seated to the right of Mrs. Kennedy in the rear seat. Governor Connolly and his wife were seated in the jump seats of the car directly in front of the president and Mrs. Kennedy. The governor was seated to the right of his wife. ASAC Roy Kellerman was seated in the right front seat of the limousine. As the motorcade departed Love Field, the president's car was closely followed by the Secret Service follow-up car, which maintained its position throughout the events of the day. Agent Roberts was seated in the front seat of the follow-up car next to the driver. Kenneth O'Donnell was seated to the left of Dave Powers in the jump seats of the car. Agents George Hickey, a driver, and Glenn Bennett were in the rear seat, with Bennett on Hickey's right. Agents Reedy and Landis rode the right running boards, with Landis behind Reedy and Agent Clint Hill, and I rode the left running board, Hill being in front of me. The motorcade was scheduled to last approximately 45 minutes as we passed through downtown Dallas. Crowds were quite heavy, and the 2 motorcycles on either flank of the presidential vehicle were of considerable assistance in keeping the motorcade clear. As the motorcade cleared the main downtown area, it made a right turn, went approximately 1 block, and then executed a left turn. After this turn, there was essentially no crowd, and green expanses of lawn stretched to the right and left of the motorcade. Well, that's obviously fucking false. We've all seen the goddamn pictures in Dealey Plaza. There was a fucking crowd. Directly in front of us was an underpass with a green sign with white lettering stating, "Entering Thornton Freeway." The presidential vehicle was approximately 200 feet from the underpass when the first shot was fired. Followed in quick succession by 2 more, I would estimate that all 3 shots were fired within 5 seconds. After the second shot, I looked at the president, witnessed his being struck in the head by the third and last shot. By that time, Mr. Roberts had used the radio in our car to direct the vehicles to a hospital. Most, if not all, the agents in the follow-up car had drawn their weapons, and Agent Hickey was handling the AR-15. None of us could determine the origin of the shots, and no shots were fired by any agent. Upon arrival at the hospital, Agent Bennett and I escorted then Vice President Johnson into a vacant treatment room. Agents Youngblood and Kivett stayed with him, while Agent Taylor and I stood nearby. Agent Bennett established security outside the door to the room. The shooting occurred approximately 12:25 p.m., and we reached the hospital approximately 12:30 p.m. That's a little off, isn't it? Yeah. Shortly after 1:30 p.m., the Vice President and Mrs. Johnson were taken to Love Field and placed aboard Air Force One. Agents Lawton, Reedy, and I established security around the aircraft. Within a short time, Mrs. Kennedy, accompanying the body of President Kennedy, arrived at Love Field and boarded Air Force One. Air Force One then departed Dallas, Texas at what I think was about 2:15 p.m. At 3:15 p.m., agents Roberts, Lawton, Reedy, and I departed Dallas, Texas via Air Force 6970, the backup plane, and arrived at Andrews Air Force Base at 6:30 p.m. We all then returned to the White House and submitted summarized reports of the day's events to Mr. Roberts. So I paused there momentarily because I'm looking at these names: Roberts, Lawton, Reedy, and Mrs. McIntyre. It's an odd bunch. It's an odd bunch. Obviously all conspirators, obviously all in on this. None of them ever mentioned the fact that Reedy and Landis jump into the vehicle to make room for Valenti and David Morales. So I'm just trying to see if to what degree would the conspirators be grouped together. Probably there's no relation here, though. All right, November 22nd, who is this from? This is from William McIntyre, also November 22nd, 63. On this date at approximately 12:30 p.m. at Dallas, Texas, I was assigned to the post of the left rear area of the running board of the Secret Service follow-up car. At this time, the President and Mrs. Kennedy were riding in the presidential limousine about 30 feet in front of my position. As we approached the underpass leading to the Thornton Freeway, there was little, if any, crowd present. I heard 3 shots fired, and observing the president, noticed that he had been struck by at least 1 bullet, I thought, in the head. I recall a rolling lawn to the right of the area where the president was shot, and seemed to also recall an expansive lawn to the left of the presidential vehicle. I attempted to locate the origin of the shots, but was unable to do so. Both the presidential vehicle and the Secret Service follow-up car immediately sped to the hospital. William McIntyre. So McIntyre, he, like Glenn Bennett, never moved throughout the assassination. So in the second row of seats, you have Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers. Dave Powers will exit the vehicle. Someone had to have taken his place in Dealey Plaza. It was either Reedy or Landis. Remember what Reedy said. Reedy said that he hopped off the car to go run to the president's vehicle, but then we have Emory Roberts clarifying that, and he said that he saw that Reedy was going to do that, and then he stopped him. So Reedy never actually got off of the Secret Service car to go run to the president's limousine. That never happened. But, and this is the big but, Reedy claims that he hopped into the front seat next to Emory Roberts. But we know that he's lying because that is not evident in McIntyre photo 1 or 2. That's a reality. So here we are. We happen to have a statement here from John Reedy. So let's go ahead and read it. This is a more in-depth statement than the other one that I read. Let me see, 1 full page. Yeah, we got 1 and 1. We have 2 statements from him. One's 1 page and the other is a half a page. So hopefully we'll get to the bottom of this. I jest because we already have gotten to the bottom of this, and he's a fucking liar, right? I, John D. Reedy, Special Agent, United States Secret Service, Washington, D.C., arrived at Love Field, Dallas, Texas, approximately 11:40 a.m. on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, on board the presidential aircraft, U.S. Air Force Number 1. Upon arrival, I left the aircraft and went to the press area. Photographers and newsmen located near the presidential can't read that, at the rear of the plane. Here, President John F. Kennedy greeted a group of persons and then walked to the fenced-off spectator area. I followed the president and Mrs. Kennedy. After 10 to 15 minutes, the President, Mrs. Kennedy, Governor Connally, state of Texas, and Mrs. Connally entered the presidential limousine. The motorcade departed Love Field and proceeded on its scheduled route. During this motorcade, I held a post on the right front door running board of the U.S. Secret Service follow-up car. Several times en route, the president's car stopped, and the president shook hands with the crowd. In the downtown, heavily congested area of Dallas, a teenage male came forth from the crowds on my right side. I left the follow-up car, chased the youth several yards before running him into the crowds on the right side. We departed the downtown area, and the crowds diminished noticeably. At about 12:30 p.m., we began the approach to the Thornton Freeway, traveling about 20 to 25 miles per hour in a slight incline. I was about 25 to 30 feet from President Kennedy, who was located in the right rear seat. I heard what appeared to be firecrackers going off from my position. I immediately turned to my right rear, trying to locate the source, but was not able to determine the exact location. At this time, the U.S. Secret Service follow-up car seemed to slow, and I heard someone from inside the car say he shot. I left the follow-up car in the direction of the president's car, but was recalled by ASAC Emory Roberts. As the cars increased their speeds, I got back on the car and seated myself beside Mr. Roberts in the right front seat. Aha! God damn it! These motherfuckers piss me off. Even though this statement was written 60 fucking years ago, it still pisses me the fuck off. I got back on the car, which he never left as per the statements of fucking Emory Roberts, right? Emory Roberts said that he saw he was going to get off the car, and he stopped him before he fucking did. Fuck Reedy, dude. Fuck this guy. I got back on the car and seated myself beside Mr. Roberts. No, you fucking didn't. No, you didn't. The McIntyre photos are fucking crystal clear. Even as they got onto the turnoff to the Stemmons Freeway, there's two people in the front fucking seat. And Reedy's not one of them. The cars proceeded to the hospital several miles distance. On my arrival at the Parkland Hospital, Dallas, hospital personnel were awaiting the arrival of President Kennedy. After the president was taken to the emergency room, I was posted by ASAC Kellerman, Secret Service, at the door entrance. I remained on this post until notified ASAC Roberts that we were leaving for Love Field with President Johnson. I departed the hospital in a Dallas police cruiser to the rear of President Johnson. Upon my arrival at Love Field, I boarded the presidential aircraft, Air Force Number 1, expecting to depart immediately. It was at this time that I was notified that Mrs. Kennedy and the late president were returning to Washington, D.C. on this plane. ASAC Roberts asked me to set up the airport security, which I did. Kennedy arrived, and we were relieved by the 4 to 12 shift, who then boarded the presidential aircraft. At 3:15 p.m., I departed Love Field, Dallas, Texas, for Washington on the vice presidential aircraft, Air Force Number 2, and signed John Reedy. Statement from that day, Friday, November 22nd, 1963, 7:25 p.m. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, I was working the U.S. Secret Service follow-up car about 25 to 30 feet to the rear of President and Mrs. Kennedy, Governor and Mrs. Connally of Texas. At about 12:30 p.m., I heard what sounded like firecrackers going off from my post on the right front running board. The president's car slowed. Someone in the follow-up car stated he was shot, and I left to run the president's car. At that time, I was recalled to the follow-up car and took the right front seat side of ASAC Roberts and proceeded to a hospital several miles distant. let's read this very specifically. I'm getting fucking lit sitting here reading this fucking statement. Because he thinks you're stupid. That's the thing. He and everyone else involved in this thing thinks that the American people are a bunch of fucking dumb fucks. Oh, does that burn me up? At that time, I was recalled to the follow-up car and took the right front seat aside of ASAC Roberts. When did he do that? He did it at that fucking time. At that time, I was recalled to the follow-up car and took the right front seat aside of ASAC Roberts and proceeded to a hospital several miles distant. Cocksucker. Fuck you. The shooting occurred as we were approaching the Thornton Freeway, traveling 20 to 25 miles per hour in a slight incline. It was in a decline, you dumb fuck, not an incline. There appeared to be no spectators on the right side of the roadway. Yes, there were, as is provable by the McIntyre photos. After the initial shot, I attempted to locate the area from where they had come, but was not able to. It appeared the shots came from my right rear side. All right, so now we're moving on to the statement of Paul Landis, the other piece of shit on the side of the Secret Service car, who lied about everything, and then just fucking like 2 months ago, 3 months ago, and a couple months ago lied about fucking the magic bullet stuff. It's so ridiculous, like unbelievably ridiculous, this asshole. I wish I could get in a room with this fucking guy. I'd call him out right to his fucking face. Statement of Special Agent Paul E. Landis Jr., scumbag, United States Secret Service, concerning his activities and official duties, November 22nd, 1963. On November 22nd, 1963, I arrived at Love Field Airport, Dallas, Texas, at 11:35 a.m., having traveled from Fort Worth, Texas to Dallas, Texas, on board U.S. Air Force Flight number 6970. Upon my arrival, I disembarked from the aircraft and immediately walked to where the motorcade vehicles were parked. Special Agent Sam Kinney was the first person that I recognized, and I remember speaking to him and standing by the follow-up car and jokingly asked him if he could tell me where the follow-up car was. After speaking to Sam, I walked over to Special Agent Wynn Lawson just to double-check to see if I was still assigned to work the follow-up car as had previously been arranged. He was standing by the front right fender of the car in which the president would be riding. He told me that I was still to ride in the follow-up car. Only a very few moments later, the president's aircraft was pulling up to its mooring spot, and I moved up to where I would be near the president and first lady when they disembarked from the aircraft. There appeared to be a very large crowd at the airport, and most of the people were restrained behind a chain-link fence, which was about 4 or 5 feet high. On the opposite side of the fence from the crowd, there was a very narrow sidewalk and curbing which ran along the fence line. There were several people on the same side of the fence as the president, but most of them were photographers. As soon as the president and first lady disembarked from the aircraft, Mrs. Kennedy was presented a bouquet of roses. The president was also presented what appeared to be 2 hand-drawn charcoal portraits of himself, and Mrs. Kennedy had a black leather and glass folding frame. I believe that this was given to them by a lady wearing a red coat. Just after the president received the black leather frame, I held out my hand, and he handed it to me. I'd been standing just off to Mrs. Kennedy's left, slightly in front of her. She was on the left side of the president. At this time, the president and first lady started walking towards the crowd, which was restrained behind the fence. On the way, they did stop for a few seconds to talk to an elderly lady in a wheelchair who was on the field area about 30 feet from where the above presentations were made. They then walked over to the crowd and walked along the fence from their right to their left. At first, I was in front of the president, clearing a pathway through the photographers and observing the crowd reaching over the fence. But I noticed that Mrs. Kennedy was moving along slower and becoming separated from the president. So I asked another agent, I don't recall who, to move up where I was and drop back to assist Special Agent Clint Hill, who was next to Mrs. Kennedy. I continued to keep a pathway clear for Mrs. Kennedy, removing small hand signs that had been dropped in her pathway on the sidewalk and occasionally cautioning to watch out for the curbing. At one point, where the direction of the fence made a right angle turn to the left of the way we were moving, I do remember reaching up and holding a fairly large flag away that someone was waving over the fence. Only a few feet further, and the fence and sidewalk made another 90-degree turn in the direction in which we were originally moving. At this point, we stopped momentarily and started in the direction of the cars, which were slightly behind us and had been moving all along towards us. Mrs. Kennedy asked where the president was in S.A. Hill, noticed him continuing along the fence, shaking hands with the crowd. So Mrs. Kennedy returned to the fence and did the same. Only a short distance later, the president and first lady stopped shaking hands and entered their automobile. I stood by the right rear side until the car started moving and then hopped on the right rear portion of the right running board of the follow-up car. I was standing with my right leg on the running board and my left leg up over inside the follow-up car. I stayed in this position until we were leaving the airport area and remarked that I might as well get in all the way, and so I did. I glanced at my watch, but I don't recall the time. Special Agents Glenn Bennett and George Hickey were seated to my left, respectively, in the rear of the follow-up car. Mr. David Powers was seated directly in front of me in the center portion of the follow-up car, and Mr. Kenneth O'Donnell was seated on Mr. Powers' left. Special Agent Sam Kinney was driving, and ASAC Roberts was seated in the right front seat. Special Agents John Reedy, Clint Hill, Tim McIntyre were standing on the right front, and left rear portions of the running board, respectively. The motorcade had not proceeded far when ASAC Roberts asked me to get back on the outside running board, just in case, which I immediately did. The crowd was about 2 deep along each side of the road, and I would guess that we were traveling about 20 miles per hour. As the motorcade proceeded towards the main business section of downtown Dallas, I watched the crowd for anyone trying to run towards the president's car, or any person who might be holding anything harmful in his hands. I observed the rooftops and windows of the buildings along the route. On the outskirts of town, most of the buildings were of a 1 or 2 story type structure, and very few people were on the rooftops. The crowd was 3 or more deep along the street, and we proceeded towards downtown Dallas, with most intersections more heavily crowded. The outskirts seemed to consist mostly of used car lots, junk dealers, auto parts stores, and this typical type of neighborhood. At one intersection, there were some Cuban pickets, but I don't recall exactly what their signs said, except that they did have Cuba on them. A little further towards town, some people had a sign asking the president to please stop and shake hands, which he saw as he passed and stopped. Immediately ran up to his car, and as it stopped and assumed a position next to him, and observed the crowd as it merged on the car, especially watching the hands. Most of the people were children, but I do remember one of the adult ladies who was holding a sign remarking, "It worked, our sign worked." At various places along the route, I remember Mr. Dave Powers standing and taking movies of the president's car in the crowd. The closer we came to downtown Dallas, the larger the crowds became. At several places, they were forcing their way into the street, and there was just barely enough room for the cars to get through. There were 2 motorcycle escorts on each side of the president's and the follow-up car, and in several instances, the crowd was so close that the motorcycles could not get through and had to drop completely behind the follow-up car. During these instances, S.A. Clint Hill would run up and jump on the left rear bumper of the president's car, and he would ride there until the crowd was further back away from the president's car. Just before we reached the heart of downtown Dallas, I remember noticing the new-looking, very high multi-storied skyscrapers, and I remarked to Jack Reedy that there were even people way up on the roof of one. I think the motorcade made a right turn onto Main Street, as this is the only street sign I saw I remembered. I remember thinking to myself that about every town I know of has a Main Street. This is not a witness statement, ladies and gentlemen. This does not read like a witness statement. This is a sad lament of what happened that day. It's not direct and to the point, like a police report should be, like this should be. This is a man who feels guilt. This is not the statement that I would expect from a professional, a law enforcement professional. Not even fucking close. There's emotion all kinds in this thing. The crowd lined both sides of the street and in several places was right out into the street, leaving barely enough room to get through. Not long after we turned onto Main Street, there was one boy who I would say was in his early teens who ran out from the crowd after the president's car. The follow-up cars had passed and tried to overtake the president's car. I saw him coming and tapped S.A. Reedy on the shoulder and pointed towards him. He was, something a camera. S.A. Reedy jumped off the running board, overtook the boy, and pushed him back into the crowd. When we reached the end of Main Street, we turned right and approached a gradual left turn. As we approached the intersection, and while we were turning left, the crowd seemed to thin and almost disappear around the turn. I then made a quick surveillance of a building which was to be on the president's right once the left turn was completed. It appeared to be the last one in sight. It was a modernistic type building, approximately 8 stories high, and it had large glass windows. I also seem to recollect orange paneling or siding. None of the windows were open, and I did not see anyone standing by them. I surmised that the building was closed or that all of its employees were out on the street corner. As the president's car continued around the corner, I continued to survey the crowd along the right-hand side of the road and noticed that it was fairly scattered, with hardly enough people to form a single line. I continued to look ahead to an overpass over the route we were traveling. At approximately this point, I would say the president's car and the follow-up car had just completed their turns and both were straightening out. At this moment, I heard what sounded like the report of a high-powered rifle from behind me over my right shoulder. When I heard the sound, there was no question in my mind what it was. My first glance was at the president, as I was practically looking in his direction anyway. I saw him moving in a manner which I thought was to look in the direction of the sound. I did not realize that President Kennedy had been shot at this point. I immediately returned my gaze over my right shoulder toward this modernistic building I had observed before. With a quick glance, I saw nothing and immediately started scanning the crowd at the intersection from my right to left. I observed nothing unusual and began to think that the sound had been that of a firecracker, but I hadn't seen any smoke. In fact, I recall Special Agent Jack Reedy saying, "What was it, a firecracker?" I remarked, "I don't know. I don't see any smoke." So far, the lapsed period of time could not have been over 2 or 3 seconds. All during this time, I continued to scan the crowd, returning my gaze toward the president's car. It must have been another second or two before the next shot was fired, because, as I recall, having seen nothing out of the ordinary, I then thought that maybe one of the cars in the motorcade had a blowout that it echoed off the buildings. I looked at the right front tire of the president's car and saw it was all right. I then glanced to see the right rear tire, but could not, because the follow-up car was too close. I also thought of trying to run and jump to the president's car, but did not think I could make it because of the speed at which we were traveling. I decided I had better stay where I was so that I would at least be near the first lady whom I am assigned. I think that it was at this point that I thought faster, thinking that we could not get out of the area soon enough. However, I don't have any idea how fast we were then moving. I had drawn my gun, but I am not sure exactly when I did this. I did leave my suit coat unbuttoned all during the motorcade movement, thinking at the time that I could get to my gun faster this way if I had to. I glanced towards the president, and he still appeared to be fairly upright in his seat, leaning slightly towards Mrs. Kennedy with his head tilted slightly back. I think Mrs. Kennedy had her right arm around the president's shoulders at this time. I also remember Special Agent Clinton Hill attempting to climb onto the back of the president's car. It was at this moment that I heard a second report, and it appeared that the president's head split open with a muffled exploding sound. I can best describe the sound as I heard it as the sound you would get by shooting a high-powered bullet into a 5-gallon can of water or shooting into a melon. I saw pieces of flesh and blood flying through the air, and the president slumped out of right towards Mrs. Kennedy. The time lapse between first and second report must have been about 4 or 5 seconds. My immediate thought was that the president could not possibly be alive after being hit like that. I was still not certain from which direction the second shot came, but my reaction at this time was that the shot came from someone toward the front, right-hand side of the road. I did not notice anyone in the overpass, and I scanned the area to the right of and below the overpass where the terrain sloped towards the road on which we were traveling. The only person I recall seeing clearly was a Negro, visible in light green slacks and a beige-colored shirt, running from my left to right. On the slope across the grassy section along a sidewalk, running some steps and what appeared to be a low stone wall. He was bent over while running, and I started pointing towards him, but I didn't notice anything in his hands, and by this time we were going under the overpass at a very high rate of speed. I was looking back and saw a motorcycle policeman stopping along the curb, approximately adjacent where I saw the Negro running. After we rode under the overpass, I again looked at the president's car and saw Special Agent Clint Hill lying across the trunk. He was looking back toward the follow-up car, shaking his head back and forth, and gave a thumbs down with his hands. ASAC Roberts asked if anyone got the exact time of the shooting, and someone said 12:30 p.m. Then someone told me to get inside the car and pulled me by the arm. My sunglasses fell off, and Special Agent Bennett handed them to me. Now we were on an expressway, and a few people were standing in something along the way, waving as we went by. Let me reread this paragraph. ASAC Roberts asked if anyone got the exact time of the shooting. Someone said about 12:30. Then someone told me to get inside the car and pulled me by the arm. My sunglasses fell off, and Special Agent Bennett, who's in the back seat, handed them to me. By now we were on an expressway and had a few people were standing in spots along the way, waving as we went by. So let's see if we can put this in context. His sunglasses fell off, and Agent Bennett handed it to him. Someone told him to get inside the car and pulled him by the arm. His sunglasses fell off, and Special Agent Bennett handed them to him. Now he was on an expressway. So when he says now he's on an expressway, we can indicate that now is being immediately past the triple underpass. Okay? So he here is claiming that he did get inside the car inside of fucking Dealey Plaza. Let me reread this again. Then someone told me to get inside the car and pulled me by the arm. My sunglasses fell off, and Special Agent Bennett handed them to me, who's in the back seat. Now we were on an expressway. So he was told to get in the car. He's pulled by the arm. His sunglasses fall off. We're assuming he's now inside the vehicle. And now Agent Bennett hands him back his sunglasses. And boom, now they're on the expressway. Okay? So what we fucking have are, as per their original statements, both fucking Reedy and Paul E. Landis both entered the fucking Secret Service car in Dealey Plaza before they got to the triple overpass. There it is, ladies and gentlemen. From the mouths of babes. ASAC Roberts was telling the other agents in the follow-up car to cover Vice President Johnson as soon as we stopped. Sometime around 12:37 p.m., we arrived at Parkland Memorial Hospital. All right, so I'm going to pause one more time because I just realized for the uninitiated who are not as familiar with my work, the reason that's such a big fucking deal that both of these guys entered the goddamn Secret Service car in Dealey Plaza is because we clearly have Flat Top Man on the side of the Secret Service car by the time it gets to the triple underpass, which is, by my calculations, Dave Powers got out of the fucking vehicle, and that's when David Morales stepped onto the vehicle. So we have All these motherfuckers moving around, right? So the Secret Service car had to have come to a complete stop. Dave Powers exits the vehicle. Clint Hill runs to the president's fucking limousine. But that side doesn't really matter because you have Bill McIntyre who just stands there like a dumb fuck the whole time. So at this time, you have one opening in the middle seat. Okay, so Dave Powers gets out, leaving only Kenny O'Donnell in the middle seat. Then what you have is you have both Reedy and Landis entering the middle seat, which is demonstrated in McIntyre photo number 2. Okay? So, Vince Palmera and you other dumb fucks out there, explain to me who the fucking flat top man is on the car if both Reedy and Landis are inside the Secret Service car before they get to the triple underpass. I'll fucking wait. It's David fucking Morales, obviously, right? That's why it's such a big fucking deal. And that's in McIntyre photo number 1, where we have the man standing in the back of the president's limo because we have Clinton's head hanging out over the side. The following photo, McIntyre number 2, it's just coincidence that it's Bill McIntyre on the side of the Secret Service car and McIntyre was the guy who took the picture. Pure coincidence. So, but in McIntyre photo number 2, now you got 2 people on the side of the Secret Service car, not one. You got David Morales, flat top man, and you have another person who they just picked up, and that would be Jack Valente. So, there you go. That's how it fucking went down. And we're going to go over this with pictures and stuff tomorrow. That's how I'll kick off tomorrow. We'll do the fucking presentation first. So I advise tuning into Rockfin. I'll make it free so everybody can watch. But that's why there's such a big fucking deal that they were sitting inside the fucking Secret Service car by the time they got to the underpass, because there was already a person on the outside of the car, and that's David Morales with the flat top. So there you go. All right, where can I pick up? 8-Sack Roberts was telling the other agents in the follow-up car to cover Vice President Johnson as soon as we stopped. Sometime around 12:37 p.m., we arrived at Parkland Memorial Hospital. I immediately ran to the left rear side of the president's car, reached over and tried to help Mrs. Kennedy by taking hold of her shoulders. She did not want to let go of the President Kennedy, whose head she held in her lap, and she was bending over him. She said something like, "No, I want to stay with him." Agent Hill had, in the meantime, opened the left rear door of the presidential convertible, stepped inside, and took Mrs. Kennedy by the arm. She released the president, and someone said, "Cover up his head." Agent Hill took off his suit coat and covered up the president's head. I also remember Mr. Powers leaning in the car and saying, "Oh no, Mr. President, Mr. President." By this time, someone was lifting the president's body out of the right side of the car. Agent Hill helped Mrs. Kennedy out of the car, and I followed. Mrs. Kennedy's purse and hat and a cigarette lighter were on the back seat. I picked these 3 items up as I walked through the car and followed Mrs. Kennedy into the hospital. The president's body was taken directly to an emergency room, and I think I remember Mrs. Kennedy's following the people but coming out almost immediately. The door to the emergency room was closed, and I stayed by Mrs. Kennedy's side. Someone in the meantime had brought a chair for Mrs. Kennedy to sit in, and she sat just outside of the emergency room. There were several people milling around, and with the help of a nurse, we cleared all unauthorized personnel out of the immediate area. Someone came out of the room of the president, was asked if anyone knew his blood type. ASIC Kellerman and S.A. Hill immediately reached for their wallets. ASIC Kellerman gave the man the information first. At one point, someone else came out of the president's room again and said he was still breathing. Mrs. Kennedy stood up and said, "Do you mean he may live?" No one answered. Most of the time while in the hospital, I stayed right next to Mrs. Kennedy. Twice, I believe, she went into the room where the president was. However, I remained outside by the door. A short time later, I still remember several people standing around, and I asked a doctor for help in clearing the area. At approximately 2 p.m., the president's body was wheeled from the hospital in a coffin into an ambulance. Special Agent Andrew Berger drove the ambulance. ASIC Kellerman and 8-Sack Stout were in front seat. Mrs. Kennedy, Admiral Berkeley, and Agent Hill rode in the rear of the ambulance with the president's body. I rode in the follow-up car behind the ambulance, which departed the hospital at 2:04 p.m. At 2:14 p.m., the president's body arrived at Love Field Airport, and several Secret Service agents immediately carried it on board U.S. Air Force Number 1 via the rear door. I followed on board. Wait a minute. Okay, never mind. I just read the rear door wrong. I followed on board behind Mrs. Kennedy and then moved the forward section of the plane. I witnessed the swearing in of President Johnson at 2:39 p.m. in the center compartment on board Air Force One, and at 2:47 p.m. departed Love Field Airport, Dallas, Texas via Air Force One with Mrs. Kennedy in the body of the late President Kennedy. Upon our arrival at Andrews Air Force Base, Maryland, at 5:58 p.m., I helped carry the late President Kennedy's coffin from Air Force Number 1. The body was placed in an ambulance, which departed Andrews Air Force Base at approximately 6:10 p.m., driven by Special Agent William Greer. ASAC Kellerman, Admiral Berkeley, and I rode in the front seat of the ambulance. Mrs. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy rode in the rear of the ambulance with President Kennedy's body. The above party arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital, Bethesda, Maryland, at approximately 6:55 p.m. Special Agent Hill and I escorted Mrs. Kennedy to the floor, where we immediately secured the area. Only hospital personnel signed into the area, Kennedy family members and friends, and authorized personnel were allowed in the area. I only left the 17th floor twice while Mrs. Kennedy was there, once to find Asa Kellerman in the hospital morgue and give him a telephone message from Chief Rowley. The other time was to find a White House driver. At 3:56 a.m. on November 23, 1963, Mrs. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy departed Bethesda Naval Hospital via ambulance, accompanying the late President John F. Kennedy's body to the White House. Special Agent William Greer was driving, and ASAC Kellerman accompanied. Special Agent Clinton Hill rode in the first limousine behind the ambulance, and I rode in the second limousine. The above party arrived at the White House 4:24 a.m., and that's the sworn statement of Paul Landis. Lying, fucking scum, traitor, piece of shit human being. I'd say that right to his goddamn face. Him and Clint Hill, they're both alive. I wish somebody could fucking help me get into a room with these fucking scum. All right, what do we have? Looks like we have something from the Treasury Department, United States Secret Service. Everything Secret Service related is under the Treasury. Kind of strange. Should be its own independent bureau, shouldn't it? Well, I guess they handle all the fucking counterfeit stuff that goes on too. All right, what do we got here? All right, this is another statement from Paul Landis. This thing is pretty complete. This commission's exhibit. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy has appeared to Paul E. Landis, Jr., Special Agent, U.S. Secret Service. I was assigned to work the follow-up car from Love Field Airport, Dallas, Texas. My position was on the right rear portion of the running board. Special Agent John Reedy was on the running board ahead of me. SAs Hill and McIntyre were on the left-hand running board. SAs Bennett and Hickey were in the rear seat. Kenneth O'Donnell and Dave Powers were in the middle seats. And 8th SAC Roberts was in the front seat, and Sam Kinney was driving. I remember the motorcade reaching the end of Main Street in downtown Dallas, Texas, turning right and approaching a gradual left turn. As the president's car approached the intersection to make the left turn, the crowd appeared to thin down and almost end. As we reached the intersection, I made a quick surveillance of a building on the right side of the route, which appeared to be the last one that the president would pass. It was a modernistic building, about 8 stories, with a large glass windows. None of the windows were open. Well, they actually were, so are you lying or just stupid? And I did not notice anyone standing by the windows. My first thought was that the building was either closed or that all of its employees were on the street corner. As the president's car continued around the corner, I returned my gaze to the crowd along the right-hand side of the route and noticed it was fairly scattered. I continued to look ahead to what appeared to be an overpass over the route that we were traveling. At this point in time, the president's car and follow-up car just completed its turn, and both were straightening out. At this moment, I hear what sounded like a report of a high-powered rifle from behind me. My first glance was at the president, as my eyes were almost straight ahead at that time. I did not realize that the president had been shot at this point. I saw him moving and thought he was turning in the direction of the sound. I immediately returned my gaze to the building, which I had observed before at a quick glance, and saw nothing, and dropped my eyes to the crowd at the intersection, scanning it quickly from right to left. I saw nothing out of the ordinary and thought that the sound might have been a firecracker, but I couldn't see any smoke. In fact, I think I recall Special Agent Jack Reedy saying, "What was it, a firecracker?" And I remarked, "I don't know. I don't see any smoke." All during this time, I was scanning the crowd and returning my gaze to the president's car. By then, I think I had my gun out, but I do not recall exactly when it was drawn. I then thought that maybe one of the cars in the motorcade had a blowout and that had echoed off the buildings. I looked at the front right tire of the president's car and saw it was all right, and glanced to see the right rear tire, but could not see it as the follow-up car was too close. In fact, from my position on the running board of the follow-up car, I could not see the rear bumper of the president's car. I glanced back towards the president. He still appeared to be upright in his seat, leaning slightly towards Mrs. Kennedy. It was at this moment that I heard a second report and saw President Kennedy's head split open and pieces of flesh and blood flying through the air. I also remember Special Agent Clinton Hill attempting to climb on the back of the car at the time the second shot was fired. I would guess that the time between the first and second shot was approximately 4 or 5 seconds. My reaction at this time was that the shot came from somewhere towards the front, but I did not see anyone on the overpass, and looking along the right-hand side of the road, by this time we were almost at the overpass, and the only person I recall seeing was a Negro male in light green slacks and a beige-colored shirt running across a grassy section towards some concrete steps and what appeared to be a low stone wall. He was in a bent-over position, and I did not notice anything in his hands. By now, both the president's car and follow-up car were traveling at a high rate of speed. As we passed the under the overpass, I was looking back and saw a motorcycle policeman stopping approximately where I saw the Negro running. I do not recall hearing a third shot. That's signed Paul Landis, November 27th, 1963. All right, looks like we got one more statement from Bennett we'll get through today. And we're probably going to call it after that. But this next one here is from Glenn Bennett, protective assignment of Bennett on November 22nd, 63, Dallas, Texas. Air Force 2 landed at Love Field, Dallas, Texas, 11:35 a.m. Upon deplaning, I covered the fence and press areas. The president's plane arrived at approximately 11:38 a.m. I stayed with the president and first lady during the time they greeted the crowd on the apron and along the fence. The greeting lasted for about 10 minutes, and the president and first lady entered their car and the motorcade planned to depart. I asked while moving towards the follow-up car what position I should take. Mr. Roberts informed me that I should take the right rear seat of the follow-up. I took this position and held it during the entire motorcade. I left this rear seat position at one point in the trip to assist in getting well-wishers away from the president's auto. About 30 minutes after leaving Love Field, about 12:25 p.m., the motorcade entered an intersection and then proceeded down a grade. At this point, the well-wishers numbered but a few. The motorcade continued down this grade en route to the Trade Mart. At this point, I heard what sounded like a firecracker. I immediately looked from the right crowd physical area and looked towards the president, who was seated in the right rear seat of his limousine open convertible. At the moment I looked at the back of the president, I heard another firecracker noise and saw the shot hit the president about 4 inches down from the right shoulder. A second shot followed immediately and hit the right rear high of the president's head. I immediately hollered, "He's hit," and reached for the AR-15 located on the floor of the rear seat. Special Agent Hickey had already picked up the AR-15. We peered towards the rear and particularly the right side of the area. I had drawn my revolver when I saw S.A. Hickey had the AR-15. I was unable to see anything or one that could have fired the shots. The president's car immediately kicked into high gear and the follow-up car followed. The president's auto and the follow-up proceeded to Parkland Hospital. Upon arriving at the hospital parking lot, I was instructed by ASEC Roberts to stay with the vice president who had followed us into the parking lot. I immediately went to the vice president's auto and accompanied him to a room on the ground floor of the hospital. I then continued with the vice president back to Washington, D.C., where I was relieved. That's Glenn Bennett, November 23rd, 1963. Yeah, moving on from here, we're going to get into Hickey and the other lying fucking traitors in the Secret Service follow-up car. And before we jump off everything tomorrow, I'll go ahead and I will do the I'll do a good video presentation, show how 8 men entered, 10 men left. That's how it went. Should have been 8 men in the car, but there were actually 10. So, obviously, 8 plus 2 equals 10. You have 8 Secret Service men, and they picked up 2 passengers. And we will go over that tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. If you haven't picked up the book, go get the fucking book. I don't know what you're waiting for. What else was there? There was something else. Nope, I think that's going to do it. Alrighty, everybody. I will be back tomorrow with another episode. Thank you.